When I left my college dorm with nothing, I went to live on a farm without a house. And that's when everything I thought I knew about survival got turned completely upside down. My name is Sarah, and at 21 years old, I found myself standing in the middle of nowhere with just a backpack, $300 to my name, and a handwritten address on a crumpled piece of paper. The address belonged to my late grandmother's property in rural Montana, a place I'd only heard about in stories but never actually visited. My grandmother had passed away 6 months earlier, and according to her will, she'd left me her farm. Everyone in my family thought it was worthless. My parents had even laughed when the lawyer read that part of the will. They said it was just empty land with no value, that I should sell it immediately and use whatever money I got to finish my education. But I couldn't finish my education because I'd just been kicked out of college. Not for bad grades or partying too hard, but because I simply couldn't afford it anymore. My scholarship had been cut due to budget restrictions, and my parents had made it crystal clear that they wouldn't help me financially. They believed in tough love, in making your own way, and while I understood their reasoning, it didn't make the situation any less terrifying. I'd been working 2 part-time jobs while studying, but it wasn't enough. The housing costs alone were draining every penny I made, and I was falling behind on everything. My roommate had started giving me looks that said I needed to figure things out fast, and the college administration had sent 3 notices about unpaid fees. I was drowning, and I needed a way out. That's when I remembered the farm. I remembered my grandmother telling me stories when I was little, about how she'd grown up on that land, how it had been in our family for generations. She'd described the wide open spaces, the way the sunset would paint the sky in colors you couldn't find anywhere else, and how the air smelled so clean it could heal your soul. My mother always rolled her eyes at these stories, calling them the romanticized memories of an old woman who'd forgotten how hard farm life really was. But to me, even as a child, those stories had sounded like magic. And now, with nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose, that farm seemed like my only option. It might not have been much, but it was mine, and it was a roof over my head. Or so I thought. The bus ride from Seattle to Montana took 17 hours. I watched as the landscape gradually changed from urban sprawl to small towns, then to endless stretches of farmland and forest. With each mile, I felt the weight of my old life lifting off my shoulders, replaced by a different kind of anxiety. What was I doing? I had no farming experience, no real plan, and no idea what condition the property would even be in. The lawyer had mentioned that the farm had been abandoned for nearly 15 years, ever since my grandmother had moved into assisted living. 15 years of neglect could mean anything, but I pushed those doubts aside and focused on the one thing I did know. I needed this to work. I needed to prove to myself, and maybe to my family, that I could make something out of nothing. When the bus finally dropped me off in the small town of Willow Creek, population 843, I stood on the dusty main street feeling completely out of place. I was wearing my college hoodie, jeans with holes in the knees that were fashionable in the city but just looked worn out here, and sneakers that had seen better days. My backpack contained everything I owned: some clothes, my laptop, a few books, toiletries, and that $300 in cash that represented my entire net worth. The address my grandmother had left was for a property about 8 miles outside of town, and I quickly realized that there was no Uber, no taxi service, nothing. This wasn't Seattle. This was real rural America, where people assumed you had a car, because how else would you get around? I ended up walking to the local gas station, which also served as the town's general store, post office, and apparently the social hub where everyone gathered to gossip. The moment I walked in, every conversation stopped. 5 pairs of eyes turned to look at me, taking in my city clothes and my obvious outsider status. I must have looked like I'd landed from another planet. An older man behind the counter, whose name tag read Bill, gave me a friendly but curious smile. I explained my situation, that I needed to get to the old Henderson property, and I watched as recognition dawned on several faces. The Henderson farm, my grandmother's maiden name. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted from suspicious to sympathetic. Bill told me that my grandmother had been well loved in this community, that people still talked about her kindness and her famous apple pies. He said it was a shame what had happened to the property, left to rot all these years. Then he did something that caught me completely off guard. He offered to drive me there himself, right after his shift ended in an hour. I almost cried from the relief and unexpected kindness. While I waited, I sat on a bench outside the store, and a woman in her 50s approached me. Her name was Margaret, and she owned the diner across the street. She'd known my grandmother well, and when she heard I was planning to stay at the farm, her expression turned concerned. She asked me if I knew about the condition of the place, if I had supplies, if I understood what I was getting into. I admitted that I didn't really know anything, that I was just hoping for the best. Margaret shook her head slowly and told me something that made my blood run cold. There was no house on that property anymore. A fire had destroyed it 12 years ago, not long after my grandmother had left for the assisted living facility. The local fire department had responded, but by the time they arrived, there was nothing left to save. The property had been considered a total loss, and since no one in the family had claimed it or showed any interest, it had just sat there, abandoned and forgotten. Margaret said the land itself was still good, that the old barn was still standing, and there was a well that probably still worked, but the main house was gone, completely gone. Just a foundation and some burned rubble that nature had slowly been reclaiming. I felt my stomach drop as the reality of my situation hit me. I wasn't inheriting a farmhouse with character and history. I was inheriting empty land with a barn and absolutely nothing else. When Bill drove me out to the property in his old pickup truck, the reality was somehow even worse than I'd imagined. The driveway was so overgrown with weeds and small trees that we almost missed the turn. He had to drive slowly, navigating around potholes and fallen branches, and with every bump and jolt, I felt my hope diminishing. After about 10 minutes of this rough terrain, we emerged into a clearing, and there it was. Or rather, there it wasn't. Margaret had been right. Where the house should have been, there was just a concrete foundation, cracked and covered in moss, with charred wooden beams poking up here and there like broken bones. Wildflowers and tall grass had taken over everything, creating a strange, melancholic beauty out of the destruction. In the distance I could see the barn she'd mentioned, a large red structure that was leaning slightly to one side but still standing, and beyond that, fields that stretched as far as I could see, all completely wild and untended. Bill put the truck in park and turned to look at me with genuine concern in his eyes. He said I didn't have to do this, that there were other options, that maybe I should come back to town with him and we could figure something out. But I shook my head. I'd come this far, and I had nowhere else to go. Besides, there was something about this place, even in its abandoned state, that called to me. Maybe it was my grandmother's stories echoing in my mind, or maybe it was just desperation, but I felt like this was where I needed to be. I thanked Bill for the ride and promised him I'd come into town in a few days once I'd assessed the situation. He made me take his phone number, made me promise to call if I needed anything, and then, reluctantly, he drove away, leaving me standing alone in the middle of my inheritance. The silence hit me first. I'd grown up in cities and suburbs my whole life, where there was always background noise, always something happening. Here, the silence was so complete it was almost frightening. Then, gradually, I started to hear the sounds that filled that silence. Birds singing in the trees, insects buzzing in the tall grass, the wind rustling through the leaves, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of running water. It was overwhelming and peaceful at the same time. I took a deep breath, shouldered my backpack, and started walking toward the barn. If I was going to survive out here, I needed to see what I had to work with. The barn was bigger than it had looked from a distance, probably 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, with a high-peaked roof. The red paint was faded and peeling, and several of the wooden boards had gaps between them, but overall, the structure seemed solid. The large sliding door on the front was stuck, and it took me several minutes of pushing and pulling before I managed to get it open enough to slip inside. The interior was dark and musty, with shafts of sunlight streaming through the gaps in the walls and roof, creating dramatic patterns on the dirt floor. There were old farming tools hanging on the walls, their metal surfaces covered in rust, hay bales that had long since decomposed into dusty piles, an ancient tractor that looked like it hadn't run since the 1970s, and in the back corner, a wooden ladder leading up to a hayloft. I climbed that ladder carefully, testing each rung before putting my full weight on it, and emerged into the loft space. It was surprisingly spacious up there, with enough room that you could stand up in the center without hitting your head on the roof beams. The floor was made of thick wooden planks that seemed solid, and there were a few old blankets scattered around that mice had clearly been using as nesting material. But it was dry. It was relatively clean once you brushed away the dust, and it was shelter. This would be my home, at least for now. I spent the rest of that afternoon cleaning out the loft, sweeping away years of accumulated dust and debris, shaking out the old blankets and discovering that underneath the dirt, they were actually in decent condition. I found an old kerosene lamp that still had some fuel in it, which would give me light once the sun went down. And in a wooden crate, I discovered something unexpected, a journal. The journal was leather-bound, worn but still intact, and when I opened it, I recognized my grandmother's handwriting immediately. My hands were shaking as I flipped through the pages, seeing entry after entry dating back to when she was a young woman, living on this very farm. She wrote about her daily life, about planting crops and raising animals, about falling in love with my grandfather, about the struggles and the joys of farm life. But what caught my attention most were the entries from her last few years here, before the fire. She wrote about how lonely she'd become after my grandfather passed away, how her children had all moved away and rarely visited, how she felt like she was the last guardian of a family legacy that no one else cared about anymore. She wrote about her fears that the farm would be forgotten, that all the work and love that had been poured into this land for generations would just disappear. And then, in one of her final entries, she wrote something that made tears spring to my eyes. She wrote, "If anyone in my family ever comes back here, I hope they can see what I see. Not the hard work or the isolation, but the freedom, the connection to something real and solid, the chance to build a life with your own hands, on your own terms. This land has given me everything, and if I could give my grandchildren any gift, it would be the courage to choose a different path, to not be afraid of starting over, to know that you can create something beautiful from nothing if you're willing to try." It was like she was speaking directly to me, across the years, telling me exactly what I needed to hear. I sat there in that dusty loft, clutching her journal to my chest, and I made a decision. I was going to make this work. I was going to honor her legacy and prove that this land wasn't worthless. I was going to build something here. Hey, if you're enjoying this story of starting over from nothing, I'd absolutely love it if you hit that subscribe button. And here's a question for you. If you inherited a piece of land with no house, just open space and possibilities, what would you build there? Drop your dreams in the comments below because I love hearing about what inspires you all. Your ideas might even inspire my next steps out here. Now let me tell you what happened next. The first night on the farm was the longest night of my life. As the sun set and darkness fell, I realized just how complete darkness could be when there were no street lights, no neighboring houses with their windows glowing, no ambient light from anywhere. I lit the kerosene lamp, and its small flame created a tiny bubble of light in an ocean of black. Every sound seemed amplified. The creaking of the barn in the wind, the scurrying of small animals in the walls, the hooting of an owl somewhere nearby. I wrapped myself in those old blankets, used my backpack as a pillow, and lay there on the wooden floor of the loft, staring up at the roof beams and wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. My phone had no signal out here, so I couldn't even distract myself with social media or messages from friends. I was truly alone for the first time in my life, and it was terrifying. But when morning came, something shifted. I woke up to the most incredible sunrise I'd ever seen. The sky painted in shades of pink and orange and gold that seemed impossible. Birds were singing their morning chorus, and the air coming through the gaps in the barn walls was fresh and cool and smelled like grass and earth. I climbed down from the loft and walked outside, and in the early morning light, the property looked different, less abandoned and more full of potential. I could see where the old gardens had been, still marked by ancient fence posts and the remains of stone borders. I could see fruit trees in the distance, gnarled and overgrown but still alive, still producing. And when I walked further, following the sound of running water I'd heard the day before, I discovered a small creek running along the back edge of the property, its water clear and cold and perfect. I spent that second day exploring every inch of my land. It was bigger than I'd realized, nearly 40 acres in total, with most of it being open fields that had gone wild but could potentially be cultivated again. The well that Margaret had mentioned was still there, an old hand pump that took some effort to get working but eventually produced clean water. The barn had a small attached shed that I hadn't noticed the first day, and inside I found more tools, some bags of concrete that had hardened into useless rocks, and surprisingly, several stacks of lumber that had been protected from the weather and were still in good condition. These discoveries gave me hope. I had resources. I had materials. What I needed now was a plan and the knowledge to execute it. That evening, I walked back to town. 8 miles on foot took me nearly 3 hours, but I needed supplies and I needed information. Bill at the gas station seemed surprised but pleased to see me again. I bought a notebook, some basic food supplies, matches, batteries, and a better flashlight. I asked him about local resources, about where I could learn about farming, about whether there were any programs for new farmers. He told me about the county agricultural extension office, about a community college 30 miles away that offered courses, and about a few local farmers who might be willing to give advice. Then he did something unexpected again. He refused to let me pay for half of what I'd picked out. He said my grandmother had been kind to him when he was a struggling young man trying to start his business, and this was his way of paying that forward. The kindness of strangers in this small town was starting to restore my faith in humanity. Margaret from the diner saw me walking past and called me in for dinner. She wouldn't take no for an answer, and honestly, after eating granola bars and peanut butter sandwiches for 2 days, a hot meal sounded like heaven. Over meatloaf and mashed potatoes, she told me more about my grandmother, about the farm in its glory days, about how it had been one of the most productive properties in the area. She also told me the truth about why no one in my family had wanted it. The land had been heavily mortgaged when my grandfather died, and my grandmother had worked for years to pay it off. By the time she did, she was elderly and alone, and her children saw the farm as the thing that had stolen their mother's best years. They associated it with hardship and struggle, not with the pride and independence my grandmother had felt. To them, it was worthless, because it represented sacrifice. But to me, it represented possibility. Margaret then offered me something that changed everything. She said she needed help in the diner, just part-time, a few shifts a week. It wouldn't pay much, maybe $70 a shift, but it would be enough for food and basic supplies. She could work around my schedule, and I could start whenever I was ready. I almost hugged her right there in the middle of the diner. This solved my immediate money problem and gave me a connection to the community. I told her I could start in 3 days, that I needed a little more time to set up my living situation at the barn, and she agreed with a warm smile that reminded me of my grandmother. Walking back to the farm that night, under a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Real, solid hope. Yes, I was living in a barn loft with no electricity or running water. Yes, I had almost no money and no real plan. Yes, winter was coming in a few months, and I had no idea how I was going to survive it. But I had land. I had resources. I had people willing to help, and I had my grandmother's journal full of wisdom and encouragement. Most importantly, I had something to work toward, something to build, something that was completely mine. Over the next 2 weeks, I fell into a routine. I'd wake up with the sunrise, spend the morning working on the property, clearing brush, repairing the fence around what would become a garden, organizing the tools in the barn. In the afternoons, I'd study my grandmother's journal, learning from her experiences, understanding the cycles of planting and harvesting. 3 days a week, I'd walk into town and work at Margaret's Diner, where I was slowly becoming a familiar face and meeting more of the local community. And in the evenings, I'd sit by the creek and plan my next steps, dreaming about what this place could become. The turning point came on a Thursday afternoon when I was clearing out another section of the barn and found something hidden under a tarp in the corner. At first I thought it was just more old equipment, but when I pulled the tarp away, I discovered something that would change everything. It was a small camping trailer, the kind you'd pull behind a car, probably from the 1980s based on its style. It was dusty and dirty, but when I managed to get the door open and step inside, I realized it was completely intact. There was a tiny kitchenette with a 2-burner propane stove, a small sink, a dinette that converted into a bed, and even a miniature bathroom with a toilet and shower. The upholstery was faded and smelled musty, but everything was there. This wasn't just a barn anymore. This was the foundation of a real home. I spent the entire next day cleaning that trailer from top to bottom. I scrubbed every surface, aired out the cushions, cleaned the windows until they sparkled, and checked all the systems. The propane tanks were empty, but the stove and heater connections looked functional. The water tank was dry but seemed intact with no visible cracks. The toilet worked on a basic chemical system that would need supplies but was operational. This little trailer, probably forgotten by my grandmother or left behind by workers years ago, was a gold mine. It meant I could have a proper bed, a place to cook real meals, and even the luxury of a private space that felt more like a home than the barn loft ever could. I knew it would take money to get it fully functional, money I didn't have yet, but just knowing it was there gave me something concrete to work toward. Bill helped me move the trailer out of the barn and position it near the old house foundation, where there was level ground and I could eventually connect it to the well. He brought some friends, local guys who were curious about what the Henderson girl was doing out here, and they spent an afternoon helping me set everything up. They showed me how to level the trailer using blocks, how to secure it so it wouldn't shift, and even helped me run a basic water line from the well to the trailer using some old pipes we found in the shed. It wasn't a permanent solution, and I'd still need to hand pump the water and carry it in buckets to fill the trailer's tank, but it was progress. Real, tangible progress. These men, none of whom knew me before that day, spent hours helping me simply because I was trying, because I was working hard, and because in small towns like this, that's what people did for each other. One of them, a farmer named Robert who was probably in his mid-50s, pulled me aside before they left and gave me some advice that I wrote down in my notebook as soon as they drove away. He said that if I really wanted to make this farm work, I needed to think small and sustainable at first. Don't try to plant 40 acres of crops in my first year. Instead, focus on a large garden that could feed me and provide surplus to sell at the local farmer's market. Get some chickens for eggs, maybe a couple of goats for milk and cheese. Learn the basics before scaling up. He said too many young people came to farming with big dreams and burned out in the first year because they tried to do everything at once. Start small. Learn the land, understand the seasons, and grow from there. It was practical advice that made complete sense, and it gave me a framework for moving forward. My shifts at the diner were teaching me more than just how to wait tables. I was learning about the community, about who grew what, about the local economy and how things worked in rural Montana. I learned that the farmers' market happened every Saturday morning from May through October, and that people would drive from surrounding towns to buy fresh produce and homemade goods. I learned that there was a strong demand for organic vegetables, fresh eggs, and artisanal products like jams and baked goods. I learned that my grandmother had been famous for her apple butter and her pickled vegetables, and that people still talked about them years later. These conversations were market research, though I didn't think of it that way at the time. I was just listening and learning, but I was discovering what this community needed and wanted, and how I might be able to provide it. With my first few paychecks from the diner, I started investing in the basics. I bought propane tanks for the trailer's stove and heater. I got supplies for the chemical toilet. I purchased seeds for a garden, tomatoes, lettuce, carrots, beans, squash, and herbs. I bought 4 laying hens from a local farmer for $30, and Robert helped me build a simple coop using lumber from the barn and chicken wire I bought at the hardware store. Those 4 chickens, which I named Henrietta, Beatrice, Clementine, and Dorothy, became my first livestock, and when they started laying eggs 2 weeks later, I felt like I'd won the lottery. Fresh eggs every morning, and enough extra to sell a dozen here and there to neighbors and at the diner. The garden became my obsession. I'd read my grandmother's journal entries about soil preparation, about composting, about companion planting and natural pest control. I'd spend hours in the early morning or late evening, when the Montana sun wasn't quite so intense, working the soil, pulling weeds, planting seeds, and watering everything by hand using buckets from the well. It was back-breaking work that left me exhausted and sore every single day, but it was also deeply satisfying in a way my college studies had never been. I could see the results of my labor immediately. Seeds sprouted, plants grew, and within weeks, I had the beginnings of a real garden producing real food. Living in the trailer was an adjustment, but it felt like luxury compared to the barn loft. I could cook proper meals on the propane stove. I had a comfortable bed instead of a blanket on wooden planks. I could close a door and have privacy and security. Yes, I still had to haul water in buckets. Yes, I was using a chemical toilet that needed regular maintenance. Yes, I was reading by flashlight at night to conserve the trailer's battery power. But I was warm, dry, safe, and I was eating food I'd grown myself. For someone who'd been on the verge of homelessness just a month earlier, this felt like incredible abundance. The local community continued to surprise me with their generosity and support. When word got around that I was trying to restore the Henderson farm, people started showing up with donations. Someone brought me an old refrigerator that ran on propane, perfect for the trailer. Another person dropped off boxes of canning jars, saying they'd heard I might want to preserve food for winter. A retired farmer named Thomas spent an entire afternoon teaching me how to prune the old fruit trees on the property, explaining that they could still be productive if properly cared for. He said those apple trees were probably 60 years old, heritage varieties that you couldn't find in stores anymore, and if I could get them healthy again, I'd have a valuable crop that people would pay premium prices for. But not everything was generous neighbors and pleasant surprises. There were hard realities I had to face as well. The property taxes on the land were due in 3 months, and they amounted to nearly $2,000. I had no savings, and my part-time job at the diner barely covered my immediate expenses. I needed to find a way to generate serious income, and I needed to do it quickly. The farmer's market was still 2 months away from opening for the season, so that wasn't an immediate solution. I started looking at what I had that could generate income right now, and I realized that the answer was literally growing in my backyard. Those old apple trees that Thomas had helped me prune were already showing signs of new growth, and they were covered in developing fruit. I did some research at the library in town, using their internet since I still had no connectivity at the farm, and I learned about apple butter, apple cider, dried apple chips, and other value-added products. I learned that I could harvest the apples in about 6 weeks, and if I processed them into products rather than just selling them fresh, I could multiply their value many times over. I spent hours watching YouTube videos about canning and preservation, taking notes and making lists of equipment I'd need: a large pot for cooking, canning supplies, jars and lids, labels and packaging. It would require an initial investment, but if I could make it work, it could solve my tax problem and give me a sustainable business model. Margaret became my unlikely business partner in this venture. When I explained my situation and my plan, she immediately saw the potential. She offered to lend me $300 for supplies, to be paid back from the profits, and she also offered her commercial kitchen at the diner during off hours for processing the apples. In exchange, she'd get a percentage of the products to sell at the diner and first rights to any wholesale orders. It was a fair deal, more than fair actually, and it taught me an important lesson about rural communities. People invested in each other here, not because they expected huge returns, but because they understood that when one person succeeded, the whole community benefited. Margaret wasn't just helping me. She was investing in the future of local food production and keeping my grandmother's legacy alive. The apple harvest came in late August, and it was more abundant than I'd dared to hope. Those old trees, properly pruned and cared for, produced hundreds of pounds of beautiful heritage apples, varieties with names like Wealthy, Wolf River, and Haralson, that had been popular generations ago, but were rarely seen now. I spent 2 solid weeks picking apples, sorting them, and processing them in Margaret's kitchen. I made apple butter using my grandmother's recipe from her journal, adding cinnamon and cloves and cooking it low and slow until it was thick and rich and perfect. I made apple chips by slicing the fruit thin and drying it in a borrowed dehydrator. I even made small batches of apple cider using a manual press that Thomas lent me. Every jar was labeled by hand with a simple sticker that read Henderson Heritage Farm and the product name. The first batch sold out at the farmer's market in under 2 hours. People were amazed by the quality, by the taste of apples they remembered from their childhood, and by the story of the young woman bringing her grandmother's farm back to life. I made over $800 that first day, and I stood there at my little market table, counting the cash with shaking hands, hardly believing it was real. The following week I brought twice as much product and sold out again. By the end of September, I'd not only earned enough to pay the property taxes, but also had a surplus to invest back into the farm. I paid Margaret back with interest, though she tried to refuse it, and I started planning for the next season. Winter in Montana was as brutal as everyone had warned me it would be. The temperature dropped below zero for weeks at a time, and snow piled up so high I could barely get the trailer door open some mornings. The propane heater in the trailer ran constantly, burning through fuel faster than I'd anticipated. The chickens had to be moved into the barn for warmth, and I spent hours insulating their coop and making sure their water didn't freeze. There were days when I couldn't make it to town for my shifts at the diner because the roads were impassable. I learned what real isolation felt like, spending days at a time seeing no other human, with only my chickens and my grandmother's journal for company. But I also learned about resilience. I learned to split firewood and maintain a backup heating source. I learned to stock up on supplies before storms hit. I learned to can and preserve enough food to last through months when nothing grew. I spent the long winter evenings planning the next growing season, reading farming books I'd borrowed from the library, and teaching myself about soil management, crop rotation, and sustainable agriculture. I also started writing, documenting my journey in a blog that I'd update whenever I could get internet access in town. I wrote about the challenges and the victories, about learning to live simply, about finding purpose in physical work. I didn't expect anyone to read it, but it turned out that people were hungry for stories about alternative lifestyles, about choosing different paths, about starting over. By the time spring arrived, my blog had several thousand followers, and I was getting emails from people all over the country who were inspired by what I was doing. Some were facing similar situations, looking for ways out of debt or unsatisfying careers. Others were just dreamers who enjoyed living vicariously through my adventures. A few people even asked if they could come visit the farm, volunteer for a few weeks in exchange for learning about sustainable living. This gave me an idea that would eventually transform the farm into something much bigger than I had originally imagined. But that first spring, I was focused on expansion. I plowed a full acre for vegetables, planted 3 times as many varieties as the year before, and added 6 more chickens and 2 dairy goats to my little farm. The second farmers market season was exponentially more successful than the first. I had fresh vegetables, eggs, goat cheese, apple products, and I'd even learned to make soap using goat milk and herbs from my garden. My table was one of the most popular at the market, and I started getting requests from restaurants in larger towns for wholesale orders. By the end of that summer, 2 years after arriving at the farm with nothing but a backpack and $300, I was making enough money to live comfortably, to invest in improvements, and even to start saving. I hired a contractor to pour a foundation for a small cabin I wanted to build on the old house site. Nothing fancy, just a simple structure with a bedroom, bathroom, and kitchen, but it would be mine, built with money I'd earned from the land. The third year brought the volunteers I'd tentatively invited, young people from cities who wanted to learn about farming and sustainable living. I started hosting weekend workshops, teaching others what I'd learned about gardening, preserving food, and living with less. The farm became not just my home, but a place where others could come to reconnect with simpler ways of living, to learn skills their grandparents knew, but that had been lost in modern life. I thought about my grandmother often, about how proud she would be to see the land productive again, to see it becoming a place of learning and growth. Her journal remained my most treasured possession, and I'd often read her entries aloud to visitors, sharing her wisdom with a new generation. Looking back now, from the small cabin I eventually built on that foundation, with a thriving farm around me and a community I've become part of, I barely recognize the desperate 21-year-old who arrived here with nothing. That girl thought she was running away from failure, from a life that hadn't worked out the way she'd planned. But really, she was running toward something, toward a life that was authentic and meaningful and completely her own. The farm that my family had considered worthless turned out to be the most valuable thing I'd ever been given. Not because of its monetary worth, but because it gave me the opportunity to discover who I really was and what I was capable of creating when I stopped following other people's paths and started forging my own. The barn where I spent my first night still stands, and I've converted the loft into a guest space for the volunteers and visitors who come through. The trailer that was my home for 3 years is now the farm store where I sell products. The garden has expanded to nearly 5 acres of diverse crops. The 4 chickens became a flock of 30, the 2 goats became a small dairy herd, and the land that had been silent and forgotten for 15 years is now alive with activity, with purpose, with the same energy and love my grandmother poured into it decades ago. When people ask me how I did it, how I went from homeless college dropout to successful farmer and small business owner, I tell them the truth. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have resources or knowledge or any particular advantage. What I had was necessity, stubbornness, a willingness to work harder than I'd ever worked in my life, and a community that chose to invest in me when I needed it most. This farm taught me that success isn't about following a predetermined path or meeting society's expectations. It's about being willing to start over when necessary, to build something from nothing, to turn what others see as worthless into something valuable. It's about understanding that the most important things in life aren't things at all, but rather the connections we make, the skills we develop, and the legacy we leave for those who come after us. My grandmother left me more than just land. She left me a roadmap for living authentically, and though she's been gone for years, her wisdom guides me every single day. This farm isn't just my home, it's my testament to her, my gift to the future, and my proof that when you have nothing left to lose, you have everything to gain. If this story touched your heart or inspired you in any way, I'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to this channel and become part of our community. We're all here learning, growing, and supporting each other through life's unexpected journeys. I'd love to hear your story too. Have you ever had to start over from nothing? What did you learn about yourself in the process? Drop your experiences in the comments below because your story matters, and it might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And here's my question for you. What's the biggest lesson you took away from this story? What spoke to you? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for being part of this amazing journey with me.